The honourable member for Don Valley West.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for the opportunity to speak today on the importance of the government's one-for-one rule, and I want to thank Minister of State for Small Business for sharing his time with me on this important legislation, which we are seeking to enshrine in law through this bill today. For anyone not familiar with it, the one-for-one rule places strict controls on the growth of regulatory red tape on businesses. The one-for-one rule is part of a package of system-wide reforms to Canada's federal regulatory system that we promised to implement when we released our action plan in October of 2012. Actually, Mr. Speaker, the one-for-one rule came into effect earlier than our action plan. It came into effect in April 1st of 2012. Mr. Speaker, as the Treasury Board, the President of the Treasury Board has said when announcing the one-for-one legislation, this rule is helping to create the conditions for economic growth by increasing Canadian competitiveness and reducing roadblocks to business innovation. And I would add the legislation before us will make these conditions the law of the land. Mr. Speaker, allow me to take a moment to describe how the one-for-one rule actually came about. As you may recall, in Economic Action Plan 2010, our government committed to reducing regulatory red tape in order to improve the ability of businesses and entrepreneurs to respond to emerging growth opportunities and create jobs. To do this, we created the Red Tape Reduction Commission, which was chaired by the Minister of State for Small Business and Tourism. The Commission's mandate was twofold. One, it was to identify irritants to business that stem from federal regulatory requirements and review how those requirements are administered to reduce the compliance burden on businesses, especially small business. The focus, incidentally, was to be on irritants that have a clear detrimental effect to growth, competitiveness, and innovation. And two, and it was recommended options that address the irritants and control and reduce the compliance burden on a long-term basis. Mr. Speaker, the Commission held consultations with businesses and Canadians, both in person and online, to hear their concerns with excessive red tape and how it was hampering their business. Their very consultations took place in ridings and constituencies across this country, including one in my very own Don Valley West. As a result of these consultations, the Commission recommended a combination of system-wide reforms and targeted actions. The one-for-one rule is one of the reforms that came out of that process. As I mentioned, it controls the cost of administrative burden borne by businesses, particularly small businesses. And it does it in two ways. First, under the one-for-one rule, regulators have 24 months to offset any increase in the cost of administrative burden resulting from a regulatory change with an equal cost reduction from existing regulations. And second, it requires that a regulation be taken off the books whenever a new regulation that adds an administrative burden cost is introduced. In this way, the rule controls both the cost of the administrative burden and the actual number of regulations that businesses have to deal with. And Mr. Speaker, it works. During its first year of implementation, the one-for-one rule provided a successful system-wide control on regulatory red tape impacting businesses. What's more, as of June 16, 2014, under the one-for-one rule, the government had reduced administrative burden by over $20 million and achieved a net reduction of 19 regulations. And we're confident that trend towards savings will continue, and in fact, it must continue. Mr. Speaker, let me give you a real-life example of the one-for-one rule in action. Last January, we announced a proposal to change the food and drug regulations to allow regulated pharmacy technicians to oversee the transfer of prescriptions from one pharmacy to another, a task formerly restricted to pharmacists alone, and to complete associated paperwork. So pharmacists can now spend more time providing advice to and serving customers and less time at their desks doing paperwork. As a result, pharmacies from across Canada will start to reduce their administrative burden this year, resulting in annual savings of some $15 million by 2018. Another reform has lifted the threshold of corporations reporting financial and ownership information under the Corporation Return Act. As a result, more than 32,000 businesses no longer need to file a complex government return. This change is expected to reduce the administrative burden by about $1.2 million a year. Mr. Speaker, the one-for-one rule and our other red tape reduction efforts are bearing fruit. They are increasing Canadian competitiveness, freeing businesses to innovate, invest, grow and create jobs, and enhancing Canada's reputation as one of the best places in the world in which to do business and to invest. In fact, in Bloomberg's most recent ranking of the best countries in the world for doing business, Canada placed second, just behind Hong Kong and ahead of the United States. And by following through on our action plan commitments, our government is doing the hard work required to cement this reputation. Mr. Speaker, as you know, our top priority is to create economic growth and jobs in Canada. And one of the most important ways we can do this is by maintaining high productivity. According to Statistics Canada, in 2004, gross domestic product per person in Canada was almost 300% higher than in 1961, with labor productivity accounting for 80% of that remarkable increase. Mr. Speaker, it is a key responsibility of government to set the conditions in which this productivity can continue to grow. Every effort must be made to increase the competitiveness of our firms and enable them to compete for markets. That's why reforming our federal regulatory system with measures like the one-for-one rule is crucial. It is the way to create the right climate for small businesses to grow and succeed in Canada, particularly in a time of global economic uncertainty. It's the way forward. What's more, it comes on top of a series of measures we have taken to help businesses thrive. We have gone from one of the highest marginal effective tax rates on business to among the lowest. We have lowered taxes 150 times since taking office, reducing taxes for Canadian businesses from 22% in 2007 to 15% in 2012. As a result, Canada today has the confidence of the world's investors, and we intend to keep that confidence level high with measures like this one-for-one rule legislation, which shows Canada is serious about competing with the rest of the world. Mr. Speaker, enshrining the one-for-one rule in law shows how much we believe in Canadians. We know our people can compete with the best in the world when they are not stifled with unnecessary bureaucratic red tape. That's why we are showing our faith in Canadians by giving the one-for-one rule the force of law. And Mr. Speaker, that's why I'm asking the honourable members of this House to vote for this legislation and vote for Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Beauport-Limoilou.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie mon collègue d'en face pour son discours. Je lui souhaite bienvenue en Chambre. En fait, je souhaite bienvenue en Chambre à tout le monde. Je suis très heureux de revenir moi-même. Mais là, Monsieur le Président, écoutez, quand on parle de ce débat-là, les conservateurs se montrent encore gros parleurs, petits faiseurs. Vous savez, Monsieur le Président, j'ai eu l'occasion, durant mes 3 ans et demi de mandat, de parler à de nombreux entrepreneurs, à des patrons d'organisations œuvrant dans différents secteurs. Et vous savez, quand on parle de tracasserie, oui, de paperasserie, de problèmes de démarche à faire, Bon, écoutez, juste le dossier de l'assurance-emploi, le bilan du gouvernement est exactement le contraire de ce qu'il prône dans ce projet de loi. En fait, au contraire, le gouvernement a ajouté une surcharge et ça cause énormément de problèmes aux petits entrepreneurs. Alors, comment mon collègue peut justifier son appui à ce projet de loi en laissant aller les choses sur d'autres dossiers?
The honourable member for Don Valley West.
Well, Mr. Speaker, and I want to welcome the member back as well, and I hope everybody has had a wonderful summer and we're ready to get back to work. And clearly, this bill is good work for this House. We had good news on EI last week, and I hope the member was able to find that news. But more importantly, on this issue today, I just want to read a quote, Mr. Speaker, that I think is relevant, and it's from Laura Jones, who's a Vice President of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. And she says, quote, "CFIB has always said, if it matters, measure it. The federal government continues to be a leader in fighting red tape, particularly when it comes to measuring, cutting, and publicly reporting on the burden being shouldered by small business." Mr. Speaker, I come from a business background. I understand regulatory red tape, bureaucratic red tape, and I can tell you this bill, by removing on the one-for-one basis burdensome regulation in favor of new, more refined and productive regulation, is the right direction for this government to go, and I look for the House to support this later today. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, when we think in terms of economic growth into the future and how it could positively impact our middle class, one of the things that we need to recognize is that small businesses and the vital role that they play. May I suggest to you that it's the backbone of our economy, and there are things in which we could be doing. And looking at ways in which we can reduce red tape, yes, is a very strong positive. The question that I have for the member is, to what degree does he believe that the national government has any role in terms of looking at ways in which we could better serve in getting rid of some of that red tape for other jurisdictions, like federal regulations, provincial regulations, municipal regulations? Is there a role for the federal government from his perspective?
The honourable member for Don Valley West.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my honourable colleague opposite. Clearly, there is a role, but today we're talking about the one-for-one rule. And the purpose of this legislation is clearly to remove the burdensome regulation that is crowding small business unproductively in their ability to compete on a world stage. We support free trade, and you look at the opportunities internationally. Well, regulations are required internally in this country, whether provincially or federally, and this government has a role to play in that. So yes, absolutely we must play a role, but more importantly, we must remove the hurdles that stifle small business and medium business in their ability to compete and to go and secure that business on the global stage. So I think this legislation, Mr. Speaker, plays an important part in helping us to achieve that, and I hope the member will support it.